Good morning, everyone. We are waiting for the stream that will kick us live with the other venues, Kinosal 1 and Teatersalen. We are about to embark on a 2-day conference here for the Nordic Dialogues, and we wanted to make a connection by both talking to all of you here in each of the rooms of Vega Scena, but also connect you through streams and through the stages. And hopefully we have the technique with us and we can go live. A little bit more waiting. Hello again. Good morning. So we are live on stream now. What you just saw was Alexander Montgomery-Andersen, hello, good morning, performing the piece called The Virus. This performance is a research into the indigenous peoples of the North and their struggles, traditions, and connections with the nature. Alexander works with understanding both the past and the present, going into traditions, but also reflecting on how representation and stereotyping of indigenous men work in modern society. And I feel that that transitions us easily into today's topic. My name is Silje Eikemo Sande, and I have been the project manager of the project An Inclusive Cultural Sector in the Nordics, which has been going on for 3 years now. It was initiated in 2017 by the Ministry of Culture in their year of having the chairmanship at the Nordic Council of Ministers. And I'm really grateful on behalf of the project group and Arts Council Norway to wish you a very, very welcome here on the conference that sums up the project Nordic Dialogues. When the project was initiated, it was to a backdrop of a long line of initiatives for a more diverse cultural sector, reaching back almost 20 or 30 years in many of our Nordic countries. Diversity, or mangfold, is and has been for a long time a formulated goal in the cultural sector. But the goals has not yet been achieved. And what is it that constitute the barriers for reaching the long-standing goals of diversity in the Nordic cultural sector? In order to answer this question, we formulated that this project should be a place for collecting and sharing knowledge, and that within the project, we would facilitate a dialogue with the competent and the experienced. Our goal was to extend the project into a long-term initiatives within the arts and culture. And over 70 institutions and artists has engaged with us in the conversation over the last 3 years. And today, and tomorrow, we open up the project and ask you all to take part, to share, and to learn. We based our project and also the conference today on 3 perspectives that the project has identified as vital and that we want you all to engage with. The first is the dialogue with the field of POC artists that brings us to the core of the questions, the barriers of racism and discrimination, and the need to address structures, strategies, and perception in the sector on quality, artistic freedom, and self-representation. At the conference, you will listen to POC voices in our panels and in the artistic expressions, and our group of friends, critical friends, which is a vital part of the project and that we owe a great thanks, has curated 3 of our panels today. The second perspective that we wanted you to engage with is the international research and experience that can be engaged with within and from a Nordic context. A discourse on understanding diversity work has been developed internationally and can bring much needed insights to the Nordics. At this conference, we have asked François Matarasso, Gladys Francis, and Abed Hussein to give their experiences, thoughts, and knowledge to us in the Nordic countries. The Nordic artists, critical friends, and the international perspectives will be facilitated throughout the conference. But in addition to that, the third part that is vital to the project is how to facilitate a good process. And we have therefore created a lab, a place for real-time discussions and ongoing work with incoming recommendations, proposals, and inspirations from all of you and from all the networks that has taken part in the project. We hope that you will utilize your time at this conference to engage in dialogue with the competences that are present. We all here, I believe, share the sense of urgency on the matter of diversity and inclusion in the Nordic arts and culture. And I hope that you will find the inspiration, the tools, and the dialogues that push us all towards reaching the goals that we have actually set for ourselves. You are all welcome, and please do join in the dialogue. With these words, I'd like to introduce our host for these 2 days, Asta Bestinge Lydersen. She is, she is a performing artist and a former deputy chair of Arts Council Norway, and she will take us through these 2 days. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I think 10 o'clock is really early. What do you guys think? So thank you, Silje, for giving us an outline of the project, which has brought us all together here today. And I'm really happy to see so many colleagues and friends from across the Nordics gathered in Oslo. So you're very welcome. And welcome also to our online participants, because there are people watching, maybe from home or from their workplace, and you're also very welcome. You've already discovered that as an audience, you are sitting in different rooms, because this is Vega Scene. It's a place for performing arts, for cinema, and for debate. And we're going to use this building to its max. So people are in different rooms, but we're experiencing the same program together. Some of it will be brought to you live on stage. Others things will be streamed on the cinema screens. So most of you are wearing this. Okay? Did you get your badge? Yes. Good. You can talk too. That's good. So on this badge, you will notice that there is a small triangle on the bottom, and that triangle has a color. So for instance, the room we're sitting in, which is on the very top floor, that one has a red triangle. So that means when we go for parallel sessions later today after lunch, you will be going to the room with the colored triangle. So if it's red, you come to this big cinema room. If it's blue or yellow, it's one of the other rooms, the theater hall or the other cinema hall. All right. So how many of you have downloaded the conference app? Oh, wow. The Nordics are not just culturally diverse. The Nordics are also very digitalized. So anything you are wondering about the program, or if you heard a great speaker, or if you can't remember which workshop or parallel session you signed up for, check the app. So last practical information. If, in the case of an emergency, please do not use the elevators. Use the stairs and look for these green signs. Take the nearest emergency exit and meet us on the other side of the street. All right, so we're going to start with a backdrop speech from a man who was a community artist for 40 years. He has, in many ways, dedicated his career also as a writer and as a researcher to participatory and community arts. He's going to talk about artistic quality and this very revolutionary idea that cultural diversity is normal. So when he's speaking, you have the first chance to test the app, because we're going to do a Q&A after his talk, And the questions, you can submit them through the app while he's talking. And I will be sitting there with an iPad, and I will bring these questions to the stage. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome writer and researcher François Matarasso. The stage is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, although it feels slightly odd knowing there are people that I can't see who are listening to me. I'll just put that out of my mind for now. I'm going to talk about 5 big ideas. First is the re-emergence of human and cultural diversity in our consciousness. Secondly, how democratic societies can respond to that now. Thirdly, valuing culture as a space for democratic emancipation rather than as a territory for induction. The heart of what I want to talk about is how quality has, and in the past and often still does, act as a kind of conceptual drawbridge of inclusion, lowered sometimes, raised at others. And finally, what might be the solution to how we think about cultural policy in diverse societies. This is a beautiful image from a production in Stoke-on-Trent by a company called Restoke, and the production was You Are Here, and it was about the people who now live in Stoke-on-Trent and who they are and where they come from. And I particularly love it. I often use this image because, as Asta said, most of my work has been in community art, in participatory art, where professional and non-professional artists are working together, and you can't tell who is a professional artist and who isn't a professional artist in this group. But I want to start with this question of where do you come from, because I guess it's a reasonable question for you to be asking me. I've never been in Norway before. What am I doing here? Why have I got something to talk to you about? But also because I think it is a very common question now in our societies, and it's an ambiguous question. It can be a welcoming question, but it can also be a threatening question. So where do I come from? I come from a lot of places. All my grandparents were born in different countries. They had 3 religions between them. They spoke 7 or 8 languages. Most of them didn't live in the countries where they were born. My father's father was born here in Thessaloniki, which looks like a typical European city today. This is what it looked like when that's my grandfather. This is what it looked like when he left Thessaloniki. You can, okay.
There you go.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. This is what it looked like in about 1911 when he left Thessaloniki to go and study medicine in France. At the time, the city he left was part of the Ottoman Empire. I still have his school leaving certificate, which is written in Turkish, in Arabic letters. By the time he next came back to Thessaloniki, a year later, it was a Greek city. At the time, the city you're looking at, you can see the minarets. It was a city. You can also see the classical architecture. I think it's a nice image to evoke that. It was a city with no single majority population. The Jewish community that my grandfather was part of was the biggest, the largest single community, but Greeks, Turkish people, Bulgarians, Vlachs, and others all made up this city. This is a page from a calendar that was printed actually in Constantinople by an Austrian company, an Austrian printer. It's for the 31st of December 1911. And it was it survived randomly because it was found in an old prayer book. This is Salonika. There are 4 dates on this calendar. There's the Julian calendar, the 18th of December, the Gregorian calendar, the 31st of December, the Islamic date at the top, the Hebrew date at the bottom. There is Armenian, there is Greek, there is French, there is Bulgarian, there is Turkish in Arabic characters, there is Arabic, and I dare say other languages that I can't even begin to even recognize. The reason this image is important to me is because it symbolizes something that is completely ordinary, or was completely ordinary, in the world before the First World War. A world where it was completely ordinary for people to be living together and managing to get on together. I'm not for a moment idealizing this world that my grandfather grew up in before the First World War. But it was Europe of a Europe of diversity, where it was normal for different cultures, different peoples, different languages to sit and work alongside each other. It was a world of empires before Europe before the First World War. This is Hungary, and it's just an image that shows you the diversity of language and culture and religion and nationality in one empire. Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian, German, British, French. This was the world that existed up until the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the First World War. It's the rise of nationalism that put an end to the empires. Oh, sorry, let me go back a minute. The rise of nationalism put an end to empire during the course of the 20th century. Nationalism was a very powerful idea, and it has transformed our continent because its ideal of mapping a single homogeneous group, a tribe, onto a single territory, a geographically coherent territory, proved to be very attractive. It still is very attractive to people today. But nationalism's central difficulty is, if this is where you start, is who belongs? And how do you decide who belongs? Empires are big enough that they can't do that. So they have to have a political sense of citizenship, not an ethnic sense of citizenship, as indeed the EU does today, which is how it solves the challenges of the diversities of cultures and peoples within Europe. The First World War destroyed at least 4 empires and unleashed a series of horrors that ravaged Europe during the course of the 20th century. The only way to create these idealized territories was to transform the people who lived there, either by moving them or kill them if you couldn't move them. It's been called many things: population transfer, ethnic cleansing, genocide. When my grandfather came back to Salonika in 1920 to practice as a doctor, he came back during the war between Greece and Turkey, where the peace that concluded that war involved the transfer of 1.5 million people between Turkey and Greece. So about 1.25 million Greeks were expelled from what is now Turkey and moved to Greece, and about 500,000 Turkish Muslims were expelled from what is currently Greece to Turkey. It's an extraordinary movement of populations, and that has continued during the course of the 20th century. And in fact, I was hearing earlier that one of the Creative Europe projects that Norway is involved in is exactly about this challenge of the mass movements of populations that we saw during the 20th century. And of course, if you can't move people, then you sometimes end up killing them. The Jewish community of Salonika was destroyed in 1943 and barely exists. There are about 1,500 Jewish people living in Salonika today. What that all led to in the 1950s, when I grew up, was a world that looked like this. This is an image from a Tintin book, and I grew up on Tintin, among other things. And it's an illusion of a homogeneous society, of a Europe that is largely composed of people that look like me. It was an illusion and it rested on terrible, terrible suffering that had happened during the 20th century. And then it was also maintained by ignoring or silencing all those people who did not conform to that idea in different degrees. Women, people of colour, disabled people, LGBTI people, and many other minorities were invisible in the Europe of the 1950s. And the rise of identity politics that we now see is one result of many people's growing refusal to the subordinate status accorded to them in the past. Europe today is recovering its human diversity. It's recovering it in very different ways to the world that existed 100 years ago, because of course everything changes. But that is what is happening. And I will come back to what that means for us now, but I want to just step onto a parallel track and tell you another story that is parallel to the story of this illusion, this pursuit of a fantasy of a homogeneous society. And this is what I call the invention of art. What we now call art in Europe is largely an invention of the European Enlightenment, of philosophers, artists and thinkers during the 18th century. And it is a political project. It was the use of art to try and emancipate ideas and people from the control of the church and the monarchy. So art was imagined by philosophers in the 18th century, among other things, as a way to give people autonomy and to create a new system of values that didn't derive from a supernatural deity, but derived from a natural world of science, reason, and humanity. And in doing that, those philosophers invented the idea of the fine arts, by which they usually meant painting, sculpture, music, poetry, architecture. And in an ideal of autonomy that freed the artist from the control of the church or the king or the duke that had in the past largely paid for their work. The idea of art as a self-conscious, socially critical, autonomous practice grew in the 19th century. And although many artists individually may have paid a heavy price for their emancipation, their power and status has risen steadily in Europe in the last 200 years. Their new ideas transformed the European imagination, making possible the modern world and driving social change and fueling nationalism. Artists often gave voice to the aspiration for national identity in the later 19th century. And they also created an extraordinary body of work that continues to resonate in the world today. But there is a problem with the idea of fine art. It's simply this. Implicit in the very concept of the fine arts is that you necessarily create the not fine arts. Or, as they have variously been called, folk art, or traditional art, or popular art, or commercial art, or naive art, or entertainment. And in the age of colonization that coincides with this, you also create categories like native art, oriental art, or primitive art. The Art Museum presents the recognized work of dead white European men. The Ethnographic Museum presents the anonymous art plundered from other cultures, where a single artifact is interpreted as representing an entire culture in a way that nobody would consider a single painting by a European artist to represent an entire culture. For much of the past 200 years, Europeans have consciously or unconsciously accepted the idea that there are two kinds of art. On the one hand, there's the great work of the European canon, classical music, literature, ballet, theatre and visual art, which is supposed to transcend material values and have universal appeal. Both of these pieces, incidentally, come from the Victoria and Albert Museum. One of them is fine art, the other one is unknown. It is actually I think a 17th century Spanish piece of, it's a porcelain dish, a pottery dish. But in terms of how they are valued, both financially and in terms of the knowledge that we consider to be worth holding about them, they are treated fundamentally different. So on the one hand, there is the great work of the European canon, and on the other is everything else, including the wealth of art that most people actually create and enjoy. Folk, jazz, pop, TV, drama, film, stories, knitting, singing, photography, wood carving. You could go on for the rest of the day. Because what we like doing, what we need art for, which is to make sense of our life in the world, is a universal human thing, and we all do it and we all need it. It is part of what makes us human. But since the emergence of the welfare state, since the 1950s, the very moment when some people thought we had created this idealized fantasy of a homogeneous society, that idea has been crumbling and become less and less easy to sustain. Quality is the idea that keeps those two forms of art apart. Like a drawbridge, it's lowered to let some things in and raised to keep some other things out. The division is justified by this idea of quality, which on at face value sounds reasonable. Naturally, as a society, we want to invest in the best. Who wouldn't? I've never met or worked with anybody who wanted to make or see mediocre art. But quality is a very slippery idea and easily abused. It can become a source of power and control. It can be used to silence criticism or even debate. Let me highlight a couple of ways in which this works in my own life. This is an image from a wonderful Portuguese project which has been going about 15 years, called Movement for expressive photography. Among other things, these young photographers do some remarkable work with photography work with elderly people, with people in prisons, and in this image with blind people. One of the arguments or one of the things I have been repeatedly told explicitly and implicitly about the work that I have done or been involved in working with non-professional artists throughout the course of my working life is, well, you don't care about quality. Community arts doesn't care about quality. It's, we don't meet the standards for which work is funded. We're told that implicitly, because we care about the social context of our work, or the politics of our work, or the identity issues in our work, somehow artistic quality matters less. But of course, artistic quality can't be separated from all of those things. There is a pretense that artistic quality is a neutral, universal, immaterial value. And it's not. It is rooted in the values of the people, essentially the elite 18th century white men who conceived the idea of the fine arts. It's true that the work of people like the movement for expressive photography is not the same as the work that is being produced by professional photographers. What is not true is that it is worse. It is not worse, it is different. Clearly, if you work with a blind person making photographs, you are not going to make photographs that are the same as a sighted person. But it doesn't mean they're worse photographs. They may be artistically just as powerful, just as resonant, just as meaningful. Equally importantly, it doesn't mean that nobody cares about quality, because we're not trying to do the work that is policed by the art institutions. It simply means that we are trying to do something different, but we want to do the best. As I've said, I've never met anybody who didn't want to create the best work of which they were capable, didn't have that ambition. Here's another idea about the way in which quality is used to police what is acceptable and funded and what is not acceptable. The idea that you have no standards then. So the accusation against those who question dominant ideas of artistic quality is that we are somehow relativists. We believe there are no standards and anything is good, it's fine, you just, in the words of the English novelist Kingsley Amis, who could be quite a grumpy man, he agreed with the idea that everyone can be an artist if making mud pies is art. So that's what we're accused of believing, that somehow everything is as good as everything else. But that's not true at all. Just because I don't accept your standards without question, it doesn't follow that I don't have standards, or that I don't think standards matter in the first place. I believe all sorts of things are better or worse than other things, as I'm sure everyone in this room does. It's not possible to be a human being without making those kinds of value judgments. It's how we understand ourselves and define ourselves in the world. What I question is one person's authority to impose their standards without question on another. It's a kind of cultural cleansing. Because I'm in Oslo, I wanted to make a reference to something that happened here in 1976. Some of you may know the Council of Europe held a meeting in Oslo in 1976 that I think was one of the most important meetings to happen in terms of cultural policy since the Second World War, because it created the idea of cultural democracy. This, by the way, is an image from the company that I first trained with as a community art apprentice, Greenwich Mural Workshop. This was the kind of work that people understood cultural democracy to be at the time. This is a mural that still exists today in South London, which was done with the community to show them renovating their houses and resisting their demolition, because the houses were going to be demolished. And not only they were going to be demolished, not only is the mural still there, but the houses are still there as well. And it was about people using art to make not just a political statement about not wanting to have their houses demolished, but if you like, a cultural statement, a value statement about the kind of community, the kind of street they wanted to live in. So in 1976, the Council of Europe organised a conference of European Ministers of Culture in Oslo. That was a reaction to the contestation of authority and of cultural norms that had happened in the 1960s. There had been 20 years of the welfare state by then, by the 1960s, and a whole generation of young people had grown up with good education, good health care, and access to higher level education, came out of art schools in the 1960s and revolutionized art, because they didn't see why they should follow or adopt the dominant standards of the time. And the Oslo conference tried to, was set up to, quote, compare problems of cultural policy in relation to their shared acceptance of democratic values. And here's another quote. For that conference, a report was written by a man called J. Simpson, called Towards Cultural Democracy. And in it he wrote, cultural democracy implies placing equal importance on creating conditions which will allow people to choose to be active participants rather than just passive receivers of culture. And reading the white paper that has been produced by the Norway government on culture, I read a statement that seems to me to be directly a form of recognition of that. The state's responsibilities have thus been expanded from passively refraining from intervening in freedom of speech to actively facilitating it. The challenge of cultural democracy is to say we cannot, our task, the task of cultural policy, is not simply to make a certain culture available to people. It is to allow them, to enable them, to empower them to be active participants in that cultural life. This is an image from the opening ceremony of the London Olympics at 2012, and that to me represents some of the transformation of how people today in Europe, and indeed much more widely across the world, see culture, no longer as something that they passively use and enjoy, but that something that belongs to them, something that they can be actively involved in shaping and be part of. There are lots of reasons why that has happened. Increasing education, prosperity, leisure, new technology have all combined to place the means of cultural production and, crucially, of cultural publication into the hands of more and more people. And that is a fundamental challenge to the institutions that have largely dominated our culture and our cultural policy for so many years. So, as the white paper also says, society is transitioning from generally being one large community to many small ones. I agree with that up to a point, but I also question whether the idea that we're transitioning from being one large community is not still that illusion. I don't think we ever were that homogenous community that we seemed to be in the 1950s, We only looked like that, partly because of all of the people we had excluded, and partly because of all of the people who were invisible in our societies. The academies and institutions that have acted as custodians of fine art since the Enlightenment have always been entangled with nationalism. They defend an idea of culture simultaneously claims to be universal, but somehow distinctively national. There's another parallel between the fine arts and nationalism. They are both intolerant of diversity. Believing in a single, unchanging ideal, they're obliged to police their borders and control admission. They both ask, where do you come from? Their challenge now is to adapt to a world where people come from many places, often at the same time, and have complex values. And for cultural policy, that is a fundamental challenge. We need a new basis to decide what to subsidize, what is good, because we're not relativists. We do think some things are better than others, but we need a different basis to understand that. And having decided that, how do we choose what is the best in what we've decided to support? So I would suggest a different principle for cultural democracy. If we no longer subsidize classical music because it is intrinsically better than folk music, we might decide to subsidize it because it's weak, because it cannot be left alone to the market or to the amateur sector. Folk music largely thrives independently, and personally I would suggest that the less state intervention in culture there is, the better, because culture belongs to us, not to the state. I want a state that understands its role as being to support our ability to make the culture we want and to participate in the culture we want to participate in. And that the principle that it should adopt is comparable to the principle of protecting biodiversity. That we protect biodiversity without making judgments that this frog is better than that toad. We just think that all the frogs and all the toads are important and valuable, and they all make a contribution. And I think that if we had a principle for cultural diversity that was on a parallel in terms of cultural policy, we would remove the idea that some forms of art and culture are intrinsically better than others, and instead we would start to say which forms of art and culture need our protection because they can't survive on their own. That would provide a fundamentally different basis for cultural policy today. And it would follow, I think, I mean, that principle seems to me to be fundamentally democratic, because it would aim to ensure that everybody can participate in the cultural life of the community, as promised in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No judgment is made about the value of that participation. The participation is a value in itself. So the foundation of cultural policy could be democratic participation for all on their own terms, with intervention only where it's necessary to protect the diversity of the art practiced. This is an image from Streetwise Opera that I particularly like. It was taken from a performance that they did, which was screened on the BBC in 2016. It was a performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Streetwise Opera work with homeless people and have done for nearly 20 years. And they performed the St. Matthew Passion with a vocal group called the 16, a very eminent vocal group. The figure of Jesus was played by 7 different Streetwise Opera members, and the shawl that the woman is wearing in the middle was the symbol that that was who was playing Jesus at that time. And I use this image to illustrate how culture can change and change its meaning. Clearly, people who have been singing opera only once a week for a few years, while they are also dealing with major difficulties in their life, are not going to perform Bach the same way that the singers of the 16 who've been singing several hours a day since they were 5 or 6 years old. But they're going to perform it differently. They're not going to perform it worse. When I watched this production, it was one of the most moving things that I ever saw, because I really understood the figure of Jesus as a victim who was going to be sacrificed, because the fragility of the singing expressed the vulnerability of Jesus in a way that a trained singer would never have done. So, the music of Edvard Grieg, a Sami yoik singer, or a Kurdish rap artist could all be supported on the same principle of protecting cultural diversity. But how do we decide between, say, one yoik singer and another? If we can't support them all, how do we support the best? I think one of the ways to do that is to understand the richness of the conversations that we can have about this. And I want to suggest now some different criteria for thinking about artistic quality. So these 5 criteria of artistic quality, I first worked out and proposed to the Arts Council in Ireland about 20 years ago, and they have been in use there ever since. The idea is to try and unpick what we mean by quality, because it's such a vague word. So the first is, these are elements of artistic quality. The first is craft or technique. Is the piece of work well made in its own terms, as a photograph, as a performance, as a dance? Is it actually, how well does it compare with the current standards in that field? Secondly, originality, by which I really mean, is it true to the person that's made it? Is it something that only they could make, as opposed to an imitation of something that they might think would be good? Thirdly, ambition. Is it worth doing? Is this a big statement or a small statement? If you understand art, as I do, as an act in the world, an act of meaning-making, an attempt to make sense, it happens at all scales. It can happen in a very small way, it can happen in a very big way. That image that I showed you of the London 2012 opening ceremony, where basically Britain decided, when it had the eyes of the world on it, that what it wanted to put on, above all, was a community play, was in itself a very big statement of a set of values in the world. The fourth criterion is resonance. Does it speak to me? Something can be extremely accomplished, very original, exceedingly ambitious even, but actually not communicate beyond the artist that made it at all. And finally, feeling. Does it move me? Does it connect with me in that different kind of non-rational way? This image, again, it's a favorite of mine. It was from a project that I was involved in 1989 to 1991, where we worked in the context of the closure of psychiatric hospitals in the UK. And I worked with a photographer called Ross Boyd and other artists, and we worked with the people for whom this change was happening. So people who had been living in the hospital and people who were now living in the community. And this image was made together by Ross Boyd with a young man called Simon Pearcey. And it's called Still Life with Key. And I think that it meets all of these criteria of artistic quality to a very high standard. Craft, I think it's a beautifully made photograph. It is in the tradition of European still life that is clearly demonstrated by the photographer's choice of the title, Still Life with Key. It is original. I don't think anybody but Simon Pearcey would have made that. It is about what he was living through. These are symbolic objects about life outside the hospital, because outside the hospital you have a key, you have money and you have alcohol, and this little fragile plant that has been moved from one place to another. Ambition, is it worth doing? Yes, I think it was deeply worth doing to make a piece of art that could speak to politicians who were going through a major element of social policy, and to the communities that were living through this change and suddenly finding people who had been living in psychiatric institutions as their neighbours. Does it speak to me? I think everything I've said says that it does, and I do find it very moving. One last thing to underline how sophisticated I think this image is. The health authority that managed the hospital where Simon had lived for several years was called Trent Regional Health Authority. So the choice of Trent Bitter as the beer in this image is by no means accidental. The point of these criteria for quality is not because they say that was a good image or a good piece of art. It's because they enable us to have a better conversation about it. I think that it is not possible to be right about art. In that phrase, there are two fundamentally incompatible concepts: right and art. Because art only exists when we recognize something as art. Yeah. One person will walk past a stone and think it's a stone. Another person will see a Barbara Hepworth. Unless we recognize something as art, it doesn't exist. It's not there. And therefore, the notion of rightness or correctness seems to me to be misjudged. It is always a subjective judgment. But that doesn't mean the judgment is unimportant. What it means is we need to be able to have conversations about why I think Bob Dylan deserves the Nobel Prize and why you might not think he deserves the Nobel Prize. It's an important question. But I can't be right. There isn't a right answer to that question. We have to find ways, we have to understand that talking about quality, what matters is the quality of the conversation that we can have, how we can use art as a way to understand each other and our different ways of making meaning in the world. I'm showing you some of my favorite images and not really have time to show them. This is from a project called Banlieue Bleue in the suburbs of Paris. And the guy on your left is a New York poet called Napoleon Maddox, a musician. The guy on the right is, I don't know his name sadly, but he's a kid from Clichy-sous-Bois. And they were working on making a beautiful, beautiful performance with other artists, including there's a French musician behind and a saxophonist called Roy Nathanson. They made a one-off performance about home. And I love this picture because these are two people just deciding that they're going to trust each other and make something together. And you also have to understand that Napoleon Maddox doesn't speak English. and doesn't speak French, and the kid doesn't speak English. It's art and music and what they can make together that is making this happen. And that, for me, is what all of this is about. I think the white paper on the future of culture is an admirable document, but nowhere more than in recognizing that culture is a territory for democratic participation. And that participation needs to be enabled because it's a fundamental part of how we function as a democratic society. A diverse cultural life is both an expression and a guarantor of a society's democracy. Sharing, debating, and negotiating our cultural values is the essence of democracy itself. I think it's what Hannah Arendt meant when she talked about action and that political negotiation about values. Human beings are different in many ways: age, color, body shape, sexuality, health. The list goes on. Most of the differences between us don't matter. You don't argue with somebody because they're tall. The difference in our values expressed in our culture do matter because we disagree with them. We don't all believe the same thing. The criteria of artistic quality might help us have a really interesting conversation, though, that contributes not just to developing our understanding, but to creating that sense of community that is so central to human needs. It might help us to understand that cultural diversity does not need to threaten our sense of being a community if we're willing to negotiate rather than to impose our cultural values. If we do expect to impose our cultural values, what right do we have to prevent other people from imposing theirs? This is a wonderful group called Interculture that I've worked with over the years from South London. Human diversity, and therefore cultural diversity, is a reality. It's not something that anyone has chosen. If we're democrats, if we believe in the intrinsic worth and equality of human life, we must accept that people who are different from us have the same rights and duties as we do. There can be no correct level of diversity in a society and no correct proportion of diversity in a cultural program. Like art, this is not territory where it is possible to be right. But I would like to end by suggesting a simple test of how successfully a society is managing the reality of its own diversity. It is this: does everyone feel at home? Do they feel able to express their cultural values and identity on the same basis as everyone else? Where do you come from can be a threatening question, implying that you're not at home, that you need to justify yourself in ways and to degrees that others are not required to meet. Or it can be an invitation to share your heritage and your values, an expression of interest and trust, rooted in recognition that you belong. In the end, we are all at home, trying to make the best of this life, this one world. The challenge for cultural democracy is to make that true. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. François is going to continue to be here because we're going to do a short Q&A. So I've received a few questions, and there is a possibility in this room that if you're really feeling it, you can put up your hand. But I'm going to start with the questions I've received here because I also want people in other rooms to be able to participate. I was very interested in what you were talking about when you started to get into the depth of talking about how we assess quality. And you presented a few examples or suggestions for criteria that one can use. But there is a question here that deals with another aspect of assessing quality, and that is who is assessing. So who decides what is quality in the arts, And who should decide is the question.
All of us. That seems to me to be the only way of doing it. Mostly we do it all the time. You know, you come out of the cinema and instantly you start talking about the film you've seen. You start talking about whether it was good or not, whether what you liked, what you didn't like. That we just need to find a way where people feel equally empowered to do that about the whole spectrum of art and culture. And then we learn. Then you talk to somebody who knows more about cinema and tells you, you might have thought that was a really original piece, but then they could say to you, well, no, because there were these 3 other things that had done it before. And so you start to become enriched. Of course, in practical terms, we have, when it comes to making funding decisions or making decisions about what is selected to be presented in an institution, we can't all be there in the room. But we have to find ways to open those discussions up to be more representative.
Yeah, because I think there is a big difference between assessing just as a private individual, because I think we all make assessments of all sorts of things all the time. So whenever we go and see a movie or listen to a song or you know, watch something, we always talk about it. Oh, did you like it? Oh, I think this was, you know, this was good, this was bad. But I think when it becomes really important is when it comes to public funding and who decides who gets the money. And I know this because I've been parts of boards like that. I've been in the Norwegian Arts Council. I've been in these processes. And there's a lot of power involved in terms of deciding who gets the money. Because the people who get the money are the people who are able to go ahead, become professional artists and produce their art and get an audience. So the who, what do you think in terms of who gets to sit on these boards, who decide the funding?
Okay, this is why, for me, you have to go back a step, which is to say, why are we giving the money in the first place? And there, if you accept the metaphor of protecting biodiversity, you're no longer saying we're giving you the money because we think you're better or your artwork is better. We're giving you the money because we think you're weak, you're vulnerable, you're not able to function. So already you're trying to strip out from that the value judgment that says what we fund is the best. Clearly, we have to find ways to make these processes more open and more democratic and more accountable. In the end, I don't see that as being different to the challenge of democracy in any field. You know, who decides how we support social care? Politicians. We have to elect the right politicians. We have to complain to the politicians when they don't do what we want them to do. And that's what we should be doing in the cultural sector.
Mm. But there is a question here that deals with subjectivity. And I find that having been in hundreds of processes where we are trying to make a choice who's going to get the money and who's not going to get the money, I noticed that it is very difficult sometimes to distinguish between quality and taste, or objective criteria and personal subjective feelings. So I'm a little bit critical to one of your assessment criteria, which is, does this speak to me? Do I feel it? Because I've been in processes where I have given money to stuff that I don't necessarily feel it, but I know there are other people. This will be very important for somebody else. So could you elaborate a bit on that?
Two things to say about that. First, I don't think that, I think it's possible to be an exceptional piece of work and only meet one of my quality criteria. And the example I always often use is the Sex Pistols. Technically pretty basic, not very original, not very ambitious, but they resonated with a whole generation. And they changed the world far more than most musicians of their who were their contemporaries. So that's one thing.
By the way, please tell them, not me.
Sorry. sorry, now you throw me. I hope I'm not telling anyone. I hope I'm sharing some thoughts. Anyway, yes, the question of taste and subjectivity. The example that I think helps to understand this is, imagine a music critic, and yesterday I wandered into the opera house, and there was full of children going in to see Hansel and Gretel in the afternoon. So imagine one of those children going to see Hansel and Gretel for the first time, and then an opera critic. And they might have a conversation afterwards using my criteria. And the opera critic would say, "Oh, it was so dull. I've seen this so many times." It doesn't invalidate the child who was captivated and mesmerized by something that they saw for the first time ever, and that might change their life. Those truths are absolutely real, and the value of the conversation might be that the child will hear, okay, maybe it wasn't as exciting as she thought it was, but then maybe she'll think, so it can be even better? That's fantastic. And then maybe the opera critic will remember that his jaded sensibility is just something maybe he needs to think about, and remember that how people enjoy this stuff is still real, even if he doesn't enjoy it anymore.
You started your talk with describing the way that Europe has in a way always been diverse, and that this nationalist way of thinking makes us strive for homogeneity, which this question would like you to address. Why do we embrace this idea or try and think of our nations as or make them homogeneous when it has been proven to be unattainable and unsustainable? Why do we still strive for it?
I think I'd need to be a psychologist to answer that question. I mean, clearly, it seems to me that belonging and being part of a community is a deep human need, and we all want that. But what we imagine that community to be, all communities are imagined. Yeah. What we imagine it to be is often shaped in early life by what we're told. Yeah. And actually, if you grow up in a diverse society, then you imagine that's what is normal. If you grow up in a homogeneous society or in a homogeneous social group, you imagine that is what is normal. So I think I'm not, one of the things that I'm really not trying to say is that cultural diversity is a good. It is a thing. It is a fact. It just is. And it would help us if we stopped trying to make value judgments about it and got on with each other in all our differences, and used our democratic structures and principles to negotiate our differences and the fact we don't agree.
I very much agree with you. I find it very interesting because the idea, I've noticed, especially in the Nordic context, the idea of diversity is often like diversity is something that I am the carrier of diversity, but you're not. You know, we need more people like you, so it would be more exciting in the workplace, or we need, you know, more innovative ideas because people like you are innovative, that kind of thing. To me, diversity is not something that anybody carries. It's the sum of what we all are together. And I think diversity is in a way in the space between your body and my body. That's where diversity exists and thrives and lives. So we need all these different bodies and minds and viewpoints, and in this, the sum of it all is what creates the diversity.
I agree completely. the idea, I've always been uncomfortable with diversity being used as a euphemism for people of colour or disabled people or whatever. Diversity is all of us. Humanity is diverse. The reason we use the euphemism is what we don't want to talk about is inequalities of power. And that's where the metaphor of the drawbridge and the gate and who controls the gate is important. But unless those of us like me who have been on the more privileged side of that gate are willing to stand up and defend and argue for the values and the right of it, then we never get beyond a position of claim and counterclaim, or claim and rejection. The values that I think I've been arguing for this morning don't belong to any of us, they belong to all of us.
I think we'll bring this with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, François Matarasso, he has written a book called Bread and Salt, which is from 2013, and this book is brand new. And I'm holding the paper version, but you can actually download the online version for free. Mm-hmm. And the title of the book is A Restless Art, and the webpage where you can download it is called arestlessart.com. And he's offering it to you for free. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
François.
Thank you very much, Esther.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. As a Black woman and as a performing artist, of course, I have attended a whole bunch of diversity conferences talking about how are we going to get more people like you into the arts and culture sector. So, but what I've noticed with a lot of conferences is that a lot of the time you have people giving these talks, people will sit and listen, they will do a whole lot of thinking, and then they go home or they go back to work, and then basically it's business as usual. So this conference, and especially this day, is trying something else, because all of you in the audience, in every single room, you are all full of experience, of ideas, of stuff that can be used to kind of push this agenda forward. So downstairs there is a lab, or I can say on the first floor there is a lab, which is an interactive space where you can come in, give your opinions, set the record straight. You can be filmed doing it, or you can hang a wish on the wish tree. And it's a space where you guys can continue the dialogue. So now when we're talking about these type of issues, it means we have to be willing to ask some difficult questions. We have to be able to share some insecurities, and we must enter into those uncomfortable corners where things get a bit difficult. So to prepare us all for that, it's time to move our attention back to the arts. We are going to witness a performance lecture. It's going to take place in the Black Box, the theater hall, or the Black Box, which is on the ground floor. And we ask you to just be a bit patient, because as you know, whenever we switch from one room to another, it takes a minute or two for the streaming to be up and running, and it's very important for us that everybody's with us, everybody in all the rooms, but also the people watching online. So please lean back and get ready for the Norwegian author, performing artist, and activist, Camara Lundestad Joof.
sitting in a writer's room together with 5 other Nordic writers. We have a storyboard on the wall. We're all trying to figure out what the characters are going to do and how they're going to interact, and we're going to write this together. I turn to the leader of the writing group and I say that maybe we should consider adding some diversity to some of the characters, because right now every character that we're writing is white. He looks at me and he says, I'm just not really interested in writing drug dealers. Excuse me? I'm just really not interested in writing drug dealers. I'm sitting in my bed in my apartment in Copenhagen. I'm working on my debut play. I'm writing one of the last scenes when I get an email from the director that's doing the play with me. The email is sent and addressed to the 2 heads of the institutions that are producing the play. I'm CC'd in a copy. In the email it says, "Hi everyone, the play is going great. I really believe in the potential of this performance. But I think it's important that we get a lot of attention during it, and I've been thinking about how we can manage to do that. So I'm suggesting that we change the name of the play from Pavlov's Bitch to Camara Show, A Negro Stands Up. All the best. Could we move the meeting on Tuesday an hour later?" I'm sitting in a meeting room at a museum in Sweden. I'm with the head of the institution. I'm there working with audience development. I'm advising them on demographics, on how to change the scenery of the institution, how to reach different parts of the city that they're not reaching. He turns to me and he says, "I'm really glad you're here." And I say, "Hey, I'm glad to be here." "No, but you really know what you're talking about." "Well, thank you, you're paying me a lot." "No, but what I mean is that you really understand like diversity and like multiculturalism, and you really understand like the demographics that we want to reach. But then again, at the same time, you're white." And I look at him and I say, "I'm not white." "No, but you know what I mean, like you're white." "I really don't know what you mean. I am not white." It was a compliment. I moved back to Norway and I'm writing my next play. This is a play about my brother. I'm trying to get the funding. I have a dramaturg, I have an institution I'm working with. I'm trying to get some extra funding for the documentary. So I'm writing an application, and I send the application before I send it to the funding bodies. I send the application to my dramaturg and my advisory team at the theater, and I say, "If you have any feedback, I would love it now because the deadline is tomorrow." The feedback takes in right ahead, and it says that, "Oh, the application looks really well, and I think you can actually ask for some more money. And have you thought that the title, Conversations with My Brother, is a bit blasé? And have you considered calling it Two Small Negro Children?" And I think, fuck, again? Didn't I make it? Wasn't I supposed to make it? I sit at the Kulturradet, Arts Council conference. I'm in a panel. I'm talking about this urgency to change, this urgency that we need to address what's going on in our communities, in our societies, in our art sector. We need to be a bit forward. This guy that I'm sitting in, he's also the head of some kind of arts council somewhere. He turns to me and he says, "Honey, you just need to be a bit patient. I've been working with this, with cultural diversity in the arts sector for 25 years, and things are changing, but you have to give it a little more time." So I look at him and I say, "If you've been in this position for 25 years and things are moving, this fucking slowly? Have you ever considered that maybe you're a part of the problem and maybe you should move? Jag bygger upp och du river ner. Du måste ta slut. Du måste flytta på dig. Du måste flytta på dig. I woke up at 5 o'clock this morning. At this point in this performance lecture, I was supposed to tell like 4 more stories. I was going to raise my voice. I was going to storm around the stage. I was going to try to fill this room with anger. I was going to fill this room with so much tension. I was going to storm you as an audience and into this camera. I was going to try to create this extremely uncomfortable space for all of us to be in. And then I was going to release it and diffuse it with some humor. And then we were going to talk about the uncomfortable conversation and what's happening when everything is uncomfortable, and if we can maybe find a way to share it. But I woke up at 5 this morning with this huge feeling of resistance in my body, because I am so tired of anger. I am so tired of my anger having to be revolutionary, for it to having to be so fucking avant-garde that we're going to use it to start a world order, a new one. I'm so tired of my anger being this kind of, well, thank you. I'm so tired of my anger being this kind of catalyst for change. Because maybe I'm just petty. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, that maybe right now maybe I'm just a little bit petty. You know, I want to go low. I want Michelle Obama arms, but I want to go low. Really, really fucking low. But that's not productive. And my anger needs to be productive. It needs to be a tool for change. I've been attending these conferences for 13 years. 13 years. I started when I was 18, crashing conferences, and I've tried every trick in the book. I've tried testifying. I've tried witnessing. I've tried sassy confrontation. I've tried jokes, building up the tension and then releasing it with a joke. But the thing is that when you're going to make these jokes in these kinds of spaces, then your humor has to be a bit, it has to be filled with self-deprecation. Because if you build the tension so much, the only way to release it is to self-deprecate myself a little bit, Michelle Obama arms. But the thing is that when you do self-deprecation, but you're doing it from a marginalized position, it's not deprecation, it's humiliation. And you're using your own humiliation to try to evoke something in the listener. And so far, I've concluded that in these spaces, at these conferences, my humiliation has mostly led to 2 things. Either guilt, a lot of guilt, like a lot of guilt. Tears, hugs, the stroking of the hand, I know you didn't mean it that way, another hug, an applause, some more crying, some more hugging, a lot of guilt. But guilt is a low-frequency emotion. It's not an emotion that inspires care or action. And when I haven't managed to get the guilt, what I've managed to get is the self-defense, the feeling of being attacked. And then you get another kind of anger from the audience, but not this kind of anger that you diffuse with self-deprecation, the kind of anger that you can carry with you into the institutions and say that she's very difficult to work with. And now that we've tried, we know that they are difficult to work with. It's a lot of drama. So let's just keep on going the way we've been going. We tried. We had a conference. Check. So So, yes, I've been navigating this fine line of guilt and of self-defense. And I want something more. I really, really want something more. And I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what we can create here that is more. And I think that first we have to start with the uncomfortableness of what it is that's happening in these situations, in these rooms. And I told some stories in the beginning, and you know, when you tell them, you navigate a very fine line between saying that was racist, but I'm not saying that you're a racist. Because the worst thing you can do is this society today is, well, even more than being a racist, it's more offensive to call someone a racist. You can never do that, so you don't do that. What you do is you navigate that line by saying, even though something is racist, it doesn't mean that you are racist. And then you're at the point where you're telling these stories, you're retelling these stories. And I often feel guilty, actually, when I tell these stories. I feel that I'm shaming somebody for fucking up in a moment, because this is not about individuals. And that's important to remember. This is not about individuals, it's about structures. The problem is that structures are made up by people, made up by individuals. So while you're towing this fine line of navigating all these situations, which I, when they happened, navigated perfectly, with both humor and charm and warmth and elegance, all these projects went really, really well. When you're done navigating them and you're standing there, you realize that what you've never said in any of these spaces, in any of these conversations, is that this hurts. It really fucking hurts. And I think for me, that's the most uncomfortable thing at all. To actually just admit the vulnerability of the fact that this fucking hurts. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And not even your anger will save you from that. This hurts. And I think for me, that is the most uncomfortable thing I can say to you. Because the scariest thing in the world, well, maybe not in the world, but as a Black woman navigating these spaces, the scariest thing is to be perceived as a victim. Because you're not allowed to draw the race card or the victim card or the offerrolle, as we call it in Norwegian, which sounds like a costume you can take on and off. On and off. The victim today, a hero tomorrow, black girl magic. So you're trying to navigate this space where you're not allowed to be a victim, but still you are victimized and you want to address it, but you don't want to sound whiny. Litt sutrete, liksom. There's no space for that. So I think for me, the most uncomfortable is to own the fact that this hurts, and then to ask you to carry that hurt with me. To open up for it and accept it, not out of guilt, not because I want you to feel bad, and not raise your hackles and become defensive, because that's not, none of these things are productive. I just want to be able to tell you that this hurts, and I need you to listen. Because to make sure that this is not just another day, another conference, I've been thinking, or I was thinking something else yesterday, but this morning at 5 o'clock I was thinking about power and power structures, because I spent 13 years of my career advising people with power, trying to change the people that had the power, tried to make the people that had power see me, and then evoke something in them that would turn them into allies. I spent years advising people with power, and then I thought, fuck that shit, I'm just gonna get some power. And now I got it. I got some power. I'm a fucking member of the Arts Council. I'm a board member. I got power. It's not that. But I've been thinking about what to do with power now that you have it. It's a very ungrateful role, power. And I've been thinking that the second power victimizes itself, it becomes violence. It becomes oppression. It takes up space that you're supposed to create for somebody else. It's an abuse of power. The second power victimizes itself. And now I got some power. So I was thinking, how can I use this platform, this power, this moment, this conference for something new? And that, I concluded, was to share in this uncomfortableness, because your silence won't protect you. Pain is pain. It will be painful even if you speak out or if you stay silent. But some in this room, they can choose to ignore that pain, or they can choose to help carry the load, open up the conversation and carry that burden. And at some point, your silence won't protect you either. So that's what I wanted to say. We have 2 days now with amazingly talented, brilliant, creative, analytical people who have been working their ass off for 3 years putting this together. And I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so grateful for the existence of this conference. I'm so grateful that looking out in this audience, it's just snapping with melanin, I tell you. But what I need and what I'm going to do, since I too am in a position of power, I'm going to be honest and tell you that this hurts. It really fucking hurts. I'm going to ask you to carry that hurt with me. And then I'm going to ask all of us collectively to embrace the uncomfortableness of what that means. Because it's only if we carry this uncomfortability collectively that we can move through it and move past it, and past the defenses, and past the guilt and the self-loathing, and into something that I don't think we've seen yet, but that I have high hopes for. So that's what I'm going to do as well. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to listen. But please, just listen. Thank you.
Realized after being a black child in a white country, after being a black woman in an entertainment industry and in a performing arts industry, all the things that people have told me, called me, said about me, all these things, I've realized actually that the pain of shutting up is much bigger than the pain of speaking up. So, we're here to speak up. and to keep those uncomfortable conversations going. And you are all part of these conversations. So we're going to now have a book launch. And the book launch has the same objective. It is to keep the discussions going and to confront a reality that is sometimes very uncomfortable and very painful. So you've heard about Critical Friends, which is an advisory group. They're arts and culture professionals from all the different Nordic countries. They have played a vital role in this 3-year project. And the reason why they came into being is because a lot of these diversity projects lack representation from the very groups that they're trying to represent. So Critical Friends, they have been doing just that for 3 years, asking the uncomfortable questions, providing constructive criticism. And today we're proud to present their brand new anthology. It's called Actualise Utopia. You, all of you in all the rooms here today will get your copy. It's going to be given to you when you leave the room. And that is a copy of the written word. But we start this book launch with spoken word.
The sunbeams from my open window wake me up early in the morning, telling me it's a new day to make my life better, a new day to shine bright like the sun greeting us from the sky. Then a few moments trying to remember who I am, where I am. It's funny how the answer tends to differ. One day, I'm a warrior, ready to conquer the control of myself, of my life. The next day, I feel like life is the one conquering me. Some days my heart is hopeful, ready to fill my surroundings with energy, with light. And some days I need the surroundings to fill me with the very same things. Then I ask myself, what if some days there's nothing to fill me up? When I know the possibility is never to give up. Could I invent a switch that turns on the fire like electricity turns on a light bulb? Then I remember that I am that switch, unapologetically flipping on, off, light on, rarely off, and remembering that sometimes we have to be switched off in order to be on. The pressure from the world tends to make us forget that we're allowed to be soft, in need of help. We have a right not to be a fireball of resilience all the time. We tend to forget that our existence is pure resistance. And we will not die. And don't let them forget that you come from a line of survivors. Remember the ancestral force that lives in you, that is found in your DNA. The force that they tried to erase, to hold down, but you are the evidence of the victory of your ancestors. And we carry the responsibility for the future of our children, our sisters' children, our our brothers' children, and also our parents' children. And we owe it to us to secure the future. But what if I told you it's not your burden to carry by yourself? And I love you for trying every day, every night. Know your rights, but more importantly, believe in your rights to exist, to succeed, to fail, to question, to not know better, to learn, and to try again. Thank you.
Hello,
Hi, everybody.
my name is Kemê Pellicer. I'm part of Critical Friends. I'm a multidisciplinary artist based in Finland, also a cultural worker. I work in several organizations dealing with diversity and critical thinking. I'm coordinator of Global Point in Helsinki, and I'm very proud to be here, part of Critical Friends and part of this amazing little book that we are going to introduce you.
My name is Ninos Josef. I'm a professional dancer and actor. I'm also the editor-in-chief of CultWatch, cultural political platform for arts and intersectional cultural analysis. And I was also the editor of Actualise Utopia, together with Kemê, who was the coordinator.
Yes. And you had the great pleasure to listen to Aka Niviâna, which is a multidisciplinary artist too, based in Nuuk, with her poem suites that you can find inside this book.
So, Actualise Utopia, From Dreams to Reality, is an anthology about racial barriers within the Nordic cultural field, or Nordic arts field, depending on what word you prefer to use. The focus of this publication includes artistic, educational, curatorial, and exhibition practices, but also political and commercial strategies for institutions and organizations in the arts field. And we thought we're going to present the different chapters and the different collectives and individuals that have been a part of this publication for you.
Yes. Yes, so basically it has been a collective effort. Many Nordic countries and artists and art workers, cultural workers living in the Nordics has been part of this process. So let's talk a bit about their topics and who they are. So the first chapter is by Ruska Tyttö, based in Finland. They are the translation to English would be like Brown Girls, and it's a Finnish collective for brown people by brown people, aiming for a more inclusive and norm-critical culture in Finland. Through the chapter, they will guide us through acts of self-care that so much we all need in relation with the power structures and the frictions that happen.
Selective Access and Belonging in Archaeology and Museums. It's written by a PhD archaeologist from Sweden, Chilean-Swedish Susanna Vallejos, and she touches upon the subject of how museum and cultural heritage is adjusted to the wide and Western world.
And then we have Mazen Maalouf, in the slide before, which is a Palestinian Icelandic writer. He's based in Iceland. He's a poet, he's a journalist, and his text is a narrative on the immigrant writer. So basically, this text is adding a contrast to the book, a little point of contrast, and he's sharing a very personal story, a very personal experience of how, as a displaced refugee artist in Iceland, discussing the possible benefits of tokenization sometimes among the local population of Iceland.
Diversity and Positive Representation in Nordic Children's Literature. It's written by South African PhD researcher Michelle Mpike. She's also a social entrepreneur and also the founder of Inclusive Books. And I think the title says it all. It basically touches upon the subject of how important representation is in children's literature and the psychological impact it can have of not being represented.
Then we have the text of Sheida Shafiei. I hope I'm pronouncing the name properly. She's Iran-born, Holland-raised art and cultural manager. The text combines personal experience with a reflection on representation. So what actually means, what entitles to be included in a structure when you don't have the power to change that structure? It is quite interesting.
The Meaning of Diversity in Swedish Cultural Politics is written by the collective platform that I'm actually the editor-in-chief of, Cultwatch. I was not a part of the writing, just to say that. It's not a bias article. But basically what Cultwatch and the editorial team of Cultwatch has done is that they've analyzed the use of the word diversity in cultural politics and how institutions and organizations can actually bypass it because of the way it's written in cultural policy.
And from that we pass on to Daisy Faria Nunes. Actually, probably you read already that text. If you read the program that you were given this morning, it is also included there. Daisy is a Brazilian Norwegian theater practitioner and a PhD researcher focused on ethnicity and gender. So her text has a form of manifest, and it continues this discussion about power structures, raising her strong voice as a Black indigenous woman living and doing her practice in the Western art field. So in her text, she explains how insisting and repeating became both her work methodologies and a means of survival.
The White Gaze Within the Structure is written by Maronage, which is a Danish decolonial feministic collective. And they have been analyzing different curatorial situations that happens at different art museums in Denmark and how they are permeated by a white gaze. It's a very, very interesting analysis, actually.
And we finalized this chapter of articles with Aka again. So I would like to say about Aka that her practice incorporates also her own experiences and her interests in climate change, identity and colonialism, which is absolutely related, interrelated. So Aka also has written several scripts for theater dealing with the nuances of these identity debates that we are on it. And her text combines the powerful nudity of her poetry, I love the poetry, of Sweets, with another text reflection called The Road to Utopia. And once again, in this reflection, we read about how structures include intentionally. But this time, we hear about this from the voice of indigenous perspective. And the text also leaves us with a very interesting question, that is, who will be remembered?
And then we skipped Khalid Salimi's chapter called The Seventh, which is strategies for increased cultural diversity. And basically, this is a bit of a toolbox, a tool text, where Khalid is explaining different points of very easy, we would say, but apparently not, points on how to implement diversity in your organization and institution. So if you ever need a lathund, as we say in Swedish, which means like a lazy dog, this is definitely the text for you. Yeah. Yeah, and then besides all of these amazing different chapters, we also have some very fabulous illustrations. This one is by Alejandro Montero-Bravo, who is a Swedish artist. We have this one, which is made by a Brown Island collective from Sweden as well. and Vida Sayuma from Finland. Yeah, I
Perfect.
could have pronounced that wrong a bit. And this is from Lale Khasemi-Veisari also, which is, they're all also found inside of the anthology. And then you have Nathalie Roejas Johnson, who has done this illustration, which is very, very powerful and very strong. And I think you can connect it to which chapter it is illustrated for.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the fabulous
Cover
cover by Kemê.
So basically, another part of this anthology that we are super happy about it is that we had the opportunity to include a glossary. It's not a huge glossary, but I think that is straight to the point. So this glossary aims to improve the quality of the dialogue on diversity and discrimination that we are having by providing a common place to ensure awareness in the terminology that we are using when we need to address these subjects. So even it is modest, I think we hope that improving the shared understanding and importance of acknowledging and understanding this terminology that we need to use, we will be able to take a step forward from dialogue into action.
The glossary is co-produced by Hanna Suzuki Ansham. She's a gender scientist from Sweden, together with Kemê and myself. And then it's been translated by one person from each Nordic country to make sure that it's accurate within. And it gives, as you can see, it gives an explanation in English, as well as a translation of the word or its meaning in each Nordic language as much as possible. And one of the, I wouldn't say good things, but one of the things that we actually discovered working with this glossary is that a lot of the words are actually non-existent in many of the languages, which you will find. I mean, these are apparently all existing in all Nordic languages, but you will see different examples.
Yeah. And I would like to, well, of course, there is more in the book. A text from Ninos, the editor, and a little text by me. And yeah, we contacted with Blick Design Studio and 07 Media for the design and printing. But I would like to say that this book, this little baby, is produced by kulturradet, by Arts Council Norway. For you, it is for free, it's not for sale, which means that this is a tool. This is a tool for you. This is a tool to be used by institutions, by decision makers, by organizations, to broaden their perspectives, to broaden their knowledge and the conversation, actually. So please take your copies, take them back home, read them, share them, have discussion around it, like have proper discussions and dialogues about that. If you agree or not, what is your perspective? What is the situation in your different countries?
Form a book club.
Yeah, and remember, like this is like any other book. The power of this book is alive if we use it.
It's very lightweighted, so it fits perfectly in your little purse or clutch or man purse or whatever you want to take to dinner. It's really beautiful, so if you want it on your coffee table, that works perfectly fine as well. Besides that, tomorrow we're going to have a proper conversation. I mean, this was a presentation and a launch, but a conversation more about how we have worked with this anthology and different barriers that we have found ourselves in or that we have met, and more about the process.
It's like a peek to the backstage of how this was made.
Like I said, form a book club. I mean, the book is for free, so I'm sure your friends and family will be very happy to not have to pay for another publication. Cool. Thank you so much for us. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Ninos and Kemê. You've done a great job, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. Now, Critical Friends is like this group of these immensely talented people. So, like on the walls in this space, and in the hallways. And also tomorrow, you'll actually see some beautiful images made by another critical friend. Her name is Nermin Al-Ansari, and she's made these wonderful double exposure images where she combines drawings of Icelandic landscapes with black and white photographs of Cairo city. So, you know, dealing with issues of identity and diversity in the Nordic region, I think her images are very relevant. So I'm going to give you some practical information, and it's going to be quick because I know you all want to go for lunch. And lunch is going to be around 45 minutes. There is a place called Salongen. So if you have time to just hang out a bit and you want to sit and chill and talk to people, or you want to say your opinion about something, go to Salongen. It's on the first floor in Norwegian, andre etasje. All right? There is a lab and many ways that you can express your opinions there. Now, lunch is going to be served on all floors. That means if you find yourself in the queue, just go somewhere else and you will get your food, okay? So we hope to see you again in about 45 minutes. Remember to check where your parallel session is. Some of you will come back to the same room you were sitting in now. Others will have to move, okay? And please try and use these parallel sessions as a dialogue room. Engage in the discussion. Don't be afraid. Get into those tough discussions and uncomfortable topics. Have a great lunch. See you later. So, dear friends, wow. I can't see everyone in each and every room, but please raise your hand if you're feeling like your head is buzzing with information. And raise your hand if you still think we got work to do. I think so too. There have been a lot of parallel workshops now. The temperature has been high. Things have been cooking in those different workshops and parallel sessions. There have been some confrontations and also some really constructive, nice conversation. So to give you a little feel of what has been going on today, we just want to use about 5 minutes to sum up the day and to give you some idea of what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Please welcome Project Manager Silje Eikemo Sande, and from Nordic Forum for Interculture, Niels Righolt. Vær så god.
Thank you. Thank you for still being here. It's close to 5. It's been a very long day.
Intensive day.
Intense day. But standing here after 7 hours of working with you, but also 3 years of working on this, I feel an immense gratefulness for the fact that you all engaged in the dialogue that we had today in all the parallel sessions. There has come, when we started this day, we wanted you to engage in a dialogue, but we also put Camara on the stage to say something about the emotions that rise in this dialogue. I don't know if you've noticed in the lab, perhaps.
We have.
And those emotions also came through in the parallel sessions, frustrations and also anger and hurt. And know that we see them, and know that we are bringing that back also to our institution, which in my part is the Arts Council Norway, and that we also want to bring back the emotional state that people convey to us. And that is also what tomorrow is about. It's about addressing the issues with institutional leaders, politicians, that needs to respond also to those emotions. How have you experienced it in the lab?
The lab became somewhat different from what we originally had thought, so we were very closely listening to the different sessions. So we were kind of following and they have also been following the last 3 sessions. via monitoring and streaming. So we kind of heard and participated and tried to sense all the different conflicts and the friction and the reflections and the wish of progressing and the sensibility and the vulnerability that was in the room. And we also sensed that in some rooms that didn't really work, that in some rooms the sense of being too vulnerable, too exposed and not really being accepted was actually there. And I think as one of the responsibles for setting up a conference like this, it's so important that this becomes a safe space for unsafe thinking. This becomes a safe space where we together can investigate things. And I think the lab in that sense have worked because people have really made use of the trees downstairs to put up reflections rather than recommendations for tomorrow. It's reflections on what they have experienced. And later tonight we will filter all these reflections and try to give them as fair, as honest, as straightforward a profile tomorrow when we have a short slot in the program to say what actually have come out of the 6 breakouts today. Because it's very diverse, of course. It's also quite disparate in the sense that it has many different kind of angles and perspectives to it, but it's all part of the same prism. The prism or the diamond, trying to reflect all the different aspects of creating a truly diverse cultural environment in the Nordics. And we have really overheard, listened to, being listening to some very, very interesting, very progressive and very investigative conversations in the breakouts as well.
And when Asta asked if we have anything to work on, I think all hands were raised, at least in this room and probably in the other rooms as well. And beware that all of the frustrations and emotions that have been in the room is also exposing the blind spots that all of us needs to go into and cover so that we don't have them anymore, so that we can not be blind to these issues anymore. And I hope that tomorrow that this is what we can convey the need of to our leaders of institutions, politicians, and also continue that dialogue with you as an audience, which is many of the panels is going to be about tomorrow. So really a heartfelt thank you to all of you for being here.
And that is coming from me as well. I'll just share a little thing with you. I was this morning having too much job on my mind. I had to finalize an article about interculturality, strangely enough. And from the last report from the Nordic Council of Ministers, it basically stated as a fact that the 26 million that we are today will be 30 million in 2030. And for every year, 70% of the new Nordics are born outside the Nordic country. And more than 80% of the new Nordics are born outside Europe. So we are talking about a fact that is becoming increasingly visible as the years go by. So my wish for you when we enter tomorrow is really also to help us all find a ways not to let this be a bubble of dialogue, but this be a stepping stone for a dialogue that has to continue, that has to deepen, that has to widen, and that has to become more and more visible in the formation of politics. But thank you for participating from me as well.
So.
Thank you, Silje and Niels. I think you guys need a drink. Okay, so if you're going to the dinner tonight, you're going to go to Månefisken, which is this lovely venue in an old historical building along the river in Oslo. And you will be able to have a drink from about 7:30, and the dinner will be served at 8. And if you're wondering where on earth this place is, check the app. It should have a map, and you'll be able to find it. So we are just going to round off by thanking you all for your contributions today. Whether you've been on a panel or whether you've just been engaging in discussions during breaks and lunch, we hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening.